It was a quiet Tuesday evening in the heart of Willow Creek, a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, or at least thought they did. Officer Jake Harris was patrolling the sleepy streets as part of his usual night shift. The air was still, save for the occasional hum of a distant car engine or the rustling of leaves in the soft breeze. Jake liked these kinds of nights, calm, uneventful, and predictable. But that night, something happened that would shatter the monotony and leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about his job and his town. As Jake cruised along Maple Avenue, his attention was drawn to a sleek black sedan at a stoplight. The car looked out of place, not because it was expensive or flashy, but because of who was driving it. Through the glow of the dashboard lights, he could see two young black teenagers seated inside. They seemed nervous, glancing around like they were looking for something, or someone. Jake had been on the force long enough to recognize when something didn't feel right. It wasn't the car or their appearance that raised his suspicions. It was their body language. His gut told him something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. With a flick of his signal lights, he decided to follow them, keeping a safe distance as they turned onto a quieter residential street. The car slowed to a crawl, and Jake made his move, activating his lights and pulling them over. As he approached the driver's side, his heart thudded a little harder than usual. He'd made countless traffic stops in his career, but there was something about this one, a sense of urgency he couldn't explain. The window rolled down, and Jake was greeted by two pairs of wide, anxious eyes. The twins couldn't have been older than 16. The driver's hands trembled slightly as he handed over his license and registration without being asked. His brother, sitting in the passenger seat, clutched a backpack tightly to his chest, as if it contained something precious or dangerous. "Evening, gentlemen," Jake began, keeping his tone calm and steady. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" The brothers exchanged a quick glance, their hesitation palpable. Finally, the driver spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We're going to see our mom." Jake noticed the quiver in his voice and the way his hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. There was more to this story, and Jake knew it. At this hour, everything all right? The younger twin in the passenger seat shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the backpack before meeting Jake's eyes. She needs help," he blurted out. Something in his tone struck a chord with Jake. This wasn't the usual nervousness he encountered during a routine stop. This was fear, real, raw fear. Jake's eyes flicked to the backpack and back to the boys. "What's in the bag?" The younger twin clutched it tighter, his knuckles turning white. It's nothing," he stammered, his voice cracking. Jake's instincts were screaming now. He stepped back, glancing up and down the deserted street. A sense of unease settled over him like a heavy fog. He could feel the weight of an invisible thread pulling taut, threatening to snap at any moment. "All right," Jake said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Step out of the car, both of you." The boys hesitated, but the driver finally nodded, unbuckling his seatbelt and opening the door. His brother followed suit, clutching the backpack as if it were a lifeline. Jake gestured for them to stand by the hood of the car. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his eyes locking onto theirs. "You're not in trouble, but I need to know the truth. What's in the bag, and why are you not here alone at this time of night?" The boys exchanged another glance, and for a moment, Jake thought they might bolt. But then the younger twin took a deep breath and unzipped the backpack, revealing its contents. Jake's eyes widened as he took in what he saw. His breath caught in his throat, and his mind raced to piece together what this could mean. Suddenly, the quiet street didn't feel so quiet anymore. Jake's hand instinctively went to his radio as a cold dread settled in his chest. "I need backup," he said into the receiver, his voice low but urgent. Now, whatever was happening here, Jake knew it wasn't just a simple traffic stop anymore. And as the distant sound of sirens began to fill the air, he realized that this night was about to change not just his life, but the lives of everyone on that street, and maybe even the entire town. Jake's radio crackled as the dispatcher confirmed his request for backup. The street remained eerily still, the quiet amplifying the tension. The boys stood frozen by the hood of their car, their expressions a mixture of fear and guilt. Jake took a moment to study them, his years of experience telling him that their fear wasn't directed at him. Something else was haunting them, something bigger than this traffic stop. "Look," Jake said, his voice softening as he stepped closer. "You're not in trouble yet, but I need you to be straight with me. What's going on?" The younger twin, still clutching the now-open backpack, shook his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. His older brother, the one who had been driving, inhaled deeply, trying to summon courage. "Officer, we didn't know what else to do," he said, his voice barely audible. "We're just trying to help her." Jake frowned, his curiosity growing. "Help who? Your mom?" The older twin nodded but didn't elaborate. Jake's gaze dropped to the backpack. Inside, he could see a small first aid kit, a flashlight, a bundle of rope, and what looked like a hastily folded map. None of it made sense. Not yet. Before Jake could press further, the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. A pair of patrol cars pulled up, their lights casting a red and blue glow across the quiet neighborhood. Two officers, Daniels and Martinez, stepped out, their hands resting on their holstered weapons as they approached. "What's going on, Jake?" Daniels asked, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Jake gestured toward the twins, stopped them for looking suspicious. "They're out here alone, late at night, and they're clearly hiding something. The younger one's carrying this," he said, pointing to the backpack. "They claim they're trying to help their mom." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "What kind of help involves a rope and a map?" Jake shook his head. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." He turned back to the twins. "All right, boys. If you want us to believe you, now's the time to start talking. What's going on with your mom?" The older twin hesitated, his eyes darting to his brother, who looked like he was on the verge of breaking down. Finally he spoke, his words tumbling out in a rush. "She's in trouble, okay? We were trying to get to her before." He stopped abruptly, biting his lip as if he'd said too much. "Before what?" Jake pressed, his voice firm but not unkind. The younger twin finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Before they find her." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Who's they?" Neither boy answered. Instead, they exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. Jake's patience was wearing thin, but he knew better than to push too hard. Fear like this didn't come from nowhere, and if these boys were scared, there had to be a reason. "Listen," Jake said, crouching slightly to meet their eye level. "Whatever's going on, we can't help your mom unless you tell us the truth. If she's in danger, you need to trust us." The younger twin sniffled, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie. "She told us not to tell anyone," he whispered. "She said it would make things worse." Jake glanced at Daniels and Martinez, who both looked equally puzzled. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was something these boys weren't saying, something that could make or break the situation. "Okay," Jake said, standing up and taking a step back. "Let's take this one step at a time. You said your mom's in trouble. Is she hurt?" The older twin shook his head. "Not yet," he muttered. Jake frowned. "Not yet? What does that mean?" The boy's silence was deafening. Jake's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of information. A mother in trouble, a backpack filled with supplies, and two terrified teenagers out past midnight. It didn't add up. Daniel leaned in, his voice low. "Jake, we need more to go on. We can't just stand here all night." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. He turned back to the boys. "I'm going to ask you one last time, where is your mom, and what's happening to her?" The older twin hesitated, then finally broke. "She's at the old warehouse on Mill Street," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake's eyebrows shot up. The warehouse on Mill Street had been abandoned for years, its crumbling structure a haven for trespassers and troublemakers. "What's she doing there?" "She's hiding," the younger twin blurted out before his brother could stop him. "Hiding from who?" Jake asked sharply. The boys didn't answer, their silence stretching uncomfortably long. Finally, the older twin muttered, "From the people who want to hurt her." Jake's chest tightened. He didn't know what he'd expected, but this wasn't it. "All right," he said, stepping back and motioning to Daniels and Martinez. "We're going to check it out. You two stay here with Officer Martinez." "No," the younger twin shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't go alone. They'll know you're coming." Jake froze, his heart pounding. "Who will know we're coming?" The boy's eyes darted to the backpack, then back to Jake. "The people watching her," he said, his voice barely audible. Jake exchanged a grim look with Daniels. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than a simple traffic stop. He could feel the stakes rising, the air around them growing heavier with each passing second. "We'll handle it," Jake said firmly, though his stomach churned with unease. He motioned for Daniels to follow him back to his car, leaving Martinez to watch over the twins. As Jake climbed into the driver's seat, his mind raced with possibilities. Who were these mysterious people the boys were so afraid of? And why was their mother hiding in an abandoned warehouse in the dead of night? He didn't have answers yet, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary night, and whatever they were about to uncover, it wasn't going to be good. The drive to Mill Street was short but tense. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the moon. Jake called over a block away, killing the engine and motioning for Daniels to do the same. "We go in quiet," Jake said, his voice low. "No lights, no sirens. Let's see what we're dealing with first." Daniels nodded, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered weapon. The two officers moved cautiously, their footsteps barely audible against the cracked pavement. As they approached the warehouse, Jake's pulse quickened. A faint light flickered inside, barely visible through the grimy windows. Jake signaled for Daniels to stay close as they crept toward the entrance. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. Jake reached for the door, pausing for a moment to steady his nerves. Whatever was waiting on the other side, he knew there was no turning back. Jake slowly pushed the heavy door open, its rusted hinges groaning softly in protest. The faint flicker of light inside grew stronger, casting long, eerie shadows across the dusty interior. Daniels stepped in behind him, his hand never leaving his holstered weapon. Jake scanned the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The warehouse was mostly empty, save for scattered debris and old wooden crates that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The light was coming from a small corner of the warehouse, where an old camping lantern sat atop a makeshift table. Next to it was a woman, tired, gaunt, and visibly anxious. She froze when she saw them, her body tensing like a cornered animal. "Ma'am," Jake said gently, holding his hands up to show he wasn't a threat. "We're here to help. Your boys told us you were in trouble." The woman's eyes darted to the door behind them, then back to Jake. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniels exchanged a look with Jake, his unease clearly mirrored in his expression. "Why not?" Jake asked, keeping his voice calm and steady. "They'll know," she said, her voice trembling. "They'll know someone was here, and they'll come after me and my boys." Jake frowned, stepping closer. Who's after you?" The woman shook her head, refusing to answer. Her hands clutched at the edges of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Jake could see the exhaustion etched into her face. The way her shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. "Ma'am," Jake said, his tone softening further. "We can't protect you if we don't know what's going on. Please, tell us who's threatening you." She hesitated, her eyes flickering with indecision. Finally, she exhaled shakily. "I don't even know who they are," she admitted. "They can follow me for weeks, watching me, leaving messages. At first, I thought it was random, but then they started mentioning my boys. That's when I knew I had to leave." Jake's stomach twisted. Whoever these people were, they weren't messing around. What kind of messages? The woman reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. She handed it to Jake with trembling hands. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes narrowing as he read the scrawled words. "You can't hide forever. We always find what we're looking for." Daniels leaned over Jake's shoulder, his expression darkening. "That's not just a threat. That's a promise," he muttered. Jake folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. "Do you have any idea why they're after you? Did you see something? Overhear something?" The woman hesitated again, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It's not about me," she said finally. "It's about what I have." Jake's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? What do you have?" Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside the warehouse. Jake and Daniels immediately tensed, their hands moving to their weapons. The woman's face went pale, her eyes wide with fear. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake motioned for Daniels to take cover behind one of the crates. He crouched low, his heart pounding as he strained to hear. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, until they stopped just outside the door. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake held his breath, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. Whoever was outside wasn't in a hurry, and that only made the situation more unsettling. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. The man was tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a hood. He moved with a predator's confidence, his eyes scanning the room with unsettling precision. Jake stayed hidden, his mind racing. This wasn't some random thug. This guy knew exactly what he was doing. Jake's grip tightened on his weapon as he watched the man move deeper into the warehouse, his footsteps echoing ominously. The man stopped near the table, his gaze locking onto the woman. "You've made this harder than it needed to be," he said, his voice low and cold. The woman backed away, her hands trembling. "Please," she begged. "I don't have what you're looking for." The man tilted his head slightly, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Lying won't save you," he said. Jake's instincts screamed at him to act, But he needed the right moment. He signaled to Daniels, who nodded, his weapon drawn and ready. The man took a step closer to the woman, his hand reaching into his jacket. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice rising. Jake didn't wait any longer. "Freeze!" he shouted, stepping out from his hiding spot with his weapon aimed squarely at the man. The man stiffened, his hand freezing mid-motion. Daniels stepped out as well, his gun trained on the intruder. "Hands where we can see them," Daniels barked. The man slowly raised his hands, his expression unreadable. "You've made a mistake," he said calmly. Jake's jaw tightened. "We'll see about that. Step away from the table." The man complied, his movements slow and deliberate. Jake could feel the tension in the air, the sense that this was far from over. "Who are you?" Jake demanded. "Why are you threatening this woman?" The man smirked, his eyes glinting with something that made Jake's stomach churn. "You wouldn't understand," he said cryptically. "Try me," Jake shot back, his voice firm. The man didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the door, his smirk winding slightly. Jake's gut told him that whatever was happening, it wasn't going to end here. Daniels moved forward, cuffing the man while Jake kept his weapon trained on him. "We'll take this downtown and sort it out," Daniels said, his voice steady. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something much bigger and far more dangerous. The woman sagged against the table, her relief palpable but short-lived. Jake turned to her, his voice softening. "You're safe for now, but we need to know everything. What's really going on here?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering between Jake and the man in cuffs. "It's not over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And Jake knew she was right. As the team escorted the cuffed man out of the warehouse, the tension in the air thickened. Jake couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. The man's smirk hadn't faded, even as he was loaded into the back of a patrol car. It wasn't the reaction of someone caught off guard. It was the calculated confidence of someone who still had cards left to play. The woman, still trembling, sat on one of the crates as Jake crouched beside her. Her hands clutched at her sides, and her eyes darted nervously to the patrol car outside. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Taking him doesn't mean it's over. They never work alone." Jake's jaw tightened. He could see the desperation in her eyes, and deep down, he believed her. "Then we'll make sure you and your boys are safe," he said firmly, but even as he said the words, he felt the weight of their uncertainty. Daniels appeared at the door, his face grim. "We've got him in custody, but something feels off about this whole thing," he admitted. "No ID, no phone, nothing to trace him by. And he's been quiet. Too quiet." Jake nodded. "We need to dig deeper. If this woman is right, there's more going on here than just one guy." The woman suddenly stood, her breathing quickening. "My boys, where are they? They should be here by now," she said, panic rising in her voice. Jake felt his stomach drop. He grabbed his radio, barking out orders to the other officers stationed nearby. "I need eyes on the two boys. Now." The crackle of static was followed by a response that only deepened his unease. "Negative, no sign of them at the location. They're not here." The woman gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "No, no, no," she cried. "They were supposed to stay out of sight." Jake's mind raced. The boys hadn't just wandered off. They'd been taken. "Daniels," he said, his voice low but urgent, "we need to move." Daniels didn't hesitate. "I'll alert dispatch. We'll get every available unit searching," he said, already heading for his car. Jake turned back to the woman, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll find them," he promised, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. "But I need you to tell me everything. Anything that could help us figure out who's behind this." Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to compose herself. It's something I found," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know what it was at first. Just an old flash drive hidden in a box of my late husband's things. I thought it was just memories, photos, videos, but when I plugged it in, it was something else." "What kind of something?" Jake pressed. She shook her head, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Blueprints, names, locations, things I didn't understand. I didn't even know who to go to, so I hid it. And then they started coming after me." Jake's mind reeled. If the drive contained sensitive information, it could explain why these people were so determined to silence her. But it also meant the stakes were far higher than he'd imagined. "Where's the drive now?" he asked, his tone urgent. Her face crumpled. "I gave it to my boys. I told them to keep it safe and to run if anything happened to me." Jake clenched his jaw. That explained why the boys were missing. They had become targets. He grabbed his radio again, his voice sharp. Attention all units, this is Officer Jake Carter. We have reason to believe 2 boys are in possession of critical evidence and may be in immediate danger. Priority 1 is locating them and securing their safety. The dispatcher acknowledged his call, and Jake could already hear the urgency spreading through the airwaves. A time was slipping away, and he knew they were racing against forces far more prepared than they were. The patrol car holding the cuffed man suddenly jerked to a stop, its engine stalling. Jake and Daniels exchanged a look before sprinting toward it. The officer in the driver's seat was frantically trying to restart the car, but it was dead. Before Jake could ask what happened, a loud explosion rocked the street, coming from somewhere nearby. The force of it sent a shockwave through the air, and Jake instinctively threw himself to the ground, shielding the woman as debris rained down around them. The sound of tires screeching filled the air as a black van tore down the street, heading directly for the patrol car. Jake's heart pounded as he realized what was happening. "They're coming for him," he shouted. Daniels drew his weapon, firing at the van's tires, but the vehicle swerved, narrowly avoiding his shots. Jake pulled the woman to her feet, urging her toward cover. "Stay here," he ordered before sprinting toward the patrol car. The van skidded to a stop, and masked men poured out, their movements swift and coordinated. Jake barely had time to react before they were at the car, yanking the cuffed man out and shoving him into the van. Jake raised his weapon, but the men moved with military precision, using smoke grenades to cover their escape. The thick, choking fog filled the air, obscuring everything. By the time it cleared, the van was gone, leaving only chaos in its wake. Jake's hands trembled as he lowered his weapon. They had been outmaneuvered, and now the stakes were even higher. Whoever these people were, they weren't just after the woman. They were part of something far more dangerous, and they weren't going to stop. Daniels approached, his face grim. "We got a serious problem," he said. Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, I noticed." But his thoughts were already racing ahead, focusing on the boys. They were still out there, somewhere, and they were the key to everything. The clock was ticking, and Jake knew they had to act fast, before it was too late. The street was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the van's escape, the air thick with the acrid scent of burnt rubber and smoke. Jake's heart pounded as he replayed the scene in his mind, every detail etched into his memory. The precision of the attackers, the speed at which they acted. It wasn't a random group of criminals. These people were highly trained, and their actions hinted at something far more sinister than he'd initially suspected. Daniels stood beside him, his face a mixture of frustration and determination. "This wasn't just a rescue mission," Daniels muttered, breaking the silence. "They were after something, or someone, important. That man, the cuss. He's not just a piece of this puzzle. He's the whole thing." Jake nodded, his thoughts racing. The woman's revelation about the flash drive and the boy's disappearance added layers to an already tangled web. The attacker's precision suggested an organization with resources and reach. This wasn't just about silencing one family. It was bigger, much bigger. The woman emerged from behind the crates where Jake had left her, her face pale but her resolve hardening. "I need to find my boys," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "If they have that drive, they're in more danger than you realize." Jake wanted to reassure her, to promise that everything would be okay. But the truth was, he didn't know what they were up against. "We will find them," he said instead, his tone resolute. "But we need more information. Is there anything else about that drive, anything at all, that could help us figure out who's behind this?" She hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. "I didn't want to believe it when I first saw the files," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the names, they're powerful people. Politicians, corporate leaders, even law enforcement. It's not just one group, it's an entire network." Jake felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his chest. A network this vast would have the resources to cover their tracks, to erase any evidence, and to make people disappear without a trace. The boys weren't just running from danger. They were running from an entity capable of bending the system to its will. Before Jake could respond, his radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice urgent. "Carter, we got a lead on the boys." A witness reported seeing 2 kids matching their description near the old train yard on the outskirts of town. "Units are en route." Jake didn't wait. He turned to Daniels. "We need to move, now." The train yard was a sprawling maze of rusted tracks and abandoned cars, its desolation making it the perfect place for someone to hide or be hidden. As Jake and Daniels approached, their weapons drawn, the tension in the air was palpable. The woman stayed behind in the car, her face pressed against the window as she anxiously watched them disappear into the shadows. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the yard, and Jake's hand tightened on his weapon. "Stay sharp," he whispered to Daniels. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning every corner, every darkened alcove. Then they heard it. A faint, muffled cry. Jake's heart leaped as he followed the sound, leading them to an old shipping container. The door was slightly ajar, and a dim light spilled out from inside. He motioned for Daniels to cover him as he pushed the door open, his weapon raised. Inside, the two boys were huddled together, their faces streaked with dirt and fear. Relief flooded Jake's chest as he lowered his weapon. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." But the moment was short-lived. As he reached for the boys, a sharp click echoed behind him, the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. Jake froze, his mind racing. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting those of a man standing in the shadows, his face obscured by a mask. "Step away," the man ordered, his voice cold and commanding. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Jake's grip tightened on his weapon, but he didn't raise it. "I know enough," he said, his voice steady. "These boys are coming with me." The man chuckled darkly. "You think you can just walk away? This isn't your fight, officer. Walk away now and maybe you'll live to see tomorrow." Daniels appeared in the doorway, his weapon aimed at the masked man. "Drop the gun," Daniels barked. "You're outnumbered." But the masked man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, pressing a button. A loud beeping noise filled the container, and Jake's stomach dropped as he realized what it was. "Bomb," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The boys' eyes widened in terror, and Jake acted on instinct, grabbing them and shoving them toward the door. "Run!" he shouted. The explosion rocked the container, the force of it throwing Jake and Daniels to the ground. The world spun around him as debris rained down, and for a moment, all he could hear was the ringing in his ears. When the dust settled, the masked man was gone. Jake struggled to his feet, his body aching, but his focus was on the boys. They were shaken but unharmed, thanks to Daniels, who had shielded them with his body. Jake's radio crackled again, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the chaos. "Carter, we've got another problem. The man you arrested, the one who escaped, his fingerprints just came back. He's not who we thought he was. He's connected to an international crime syndicate. You need to get those boys out of there now." Jake's heart sank. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. The boys were safe for now, but the syndicate wasn't going to stop. They had resources, manpower, and now a vendetta. As Jake looked at the boys, he made a silent vow. He would protect them, no matter what it took. But deep down, he knew the fight was just beginning, and the cost of failure would be unimaginable.